Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for entertaining subject matter on this bill. I know the importance of pensions as part of our overall state budget problem, and we recognize that there have to be ideas put forward as a mechanism for us to be able to solve it. So I'm hoping that some of the material in this bill will help inform the committee and help inform the General Assembly as we move forward to how to deal with our pension problem. Let me first state that from my point of view, we have two separate problems in the pension system. One is, what do we do about the unfunded liability estimated to be in excess of $80 billion? That's accumulated. We need to deal with that some way. But even if one was to get a lump sum that suddenly magically made that unfunded liability disappear, there would still be the question of whether or not the system is sustainable. That is to say, would the state's required contribution be growing at a rate that we would have revenue that could keep up with it? I think that right now one of our problems is that that rate of growth exceeds what we could keep up with. And it would be dangerous in going back into generating more unfunded liability unless we also address that. So what this House bill does is provide some ideas and would seek to address the issues going forward for the 5 state systems. It's really primarily based on 3 pieces that would address it. One of which is providing that all 5 systems, both Tier 1 and Tier 2, would offer a defined contribution system which is copied directly from what State University's retirement system already provides and has provided for its employees for over a decade. So that's one piece of it. And that just basically says if you're in the system, you would be able to select, essentially cash out the value of your plan, use that to start a defined contribution. Employee pays 8%, the state pays 7.1%, exactly the formula by which we use in the State University retirement system. The other 2 pieces are newer to the idea of pensions. I say that's one that we've had at least in part of the pension code for quite some time. The next piece says, let's look at what is the maximum pensionable salary. So a key piece of the Tier 2 bill was to create a limit based initially on the Social Security maximum for what would be the maximum salary for calculating a defined benefit pension. What this bill does is it recognizes that if you have a salary, you could expect a benefit based on that. But going forward, beyond the end of any current contract that you would be in at the time that this bill or something modeled on it would pass, there's no expectation of a raise. So it provides that for any employee, the maximum salary for calculating a pension benefit would be the greater of your salary of the last year of your contract at the time of the passage of this bill, or the Tier 2 maximum, whichever one is bigger. So if you were making $150,000, which is above the Tier 2 maximum, if that was the best salary in the current contract, then that would become the maximum going forward. What it would also provide is for any salary above the maximum, the increment, the amount above the maximum, there would be a hybrid defined contribution plan. So there'd still be the defined benefit for that up to that maximum salary, but the amount of income above that would now qualify for a defined contribution plan where the employer would put in 3% and the employee would put in 6%. So for whatever thing, any other salary above and beyond that maximum. That's the second major piece. The third major piece deals with essentially what is the value of the benefit. One of the things that we have seen is that over the last many years, the value of the benefit has increased. And if there's an increased benefit, the legislature can charge for it. We can't collect if we failed to collect in the past, but we can charge for an increased benefit. And as measured by the normal cost, the value of the plans has increased. What this bill does is it says that that increase should be reflected by a sharing of the risk between the state and the employee. So it proposes that there be a 50% split. So whatever the normal cost is calculated to be, and we would calculate that regularly on a 3-year schedule so that we didn't get so far out of whack as we currently have gotten ourselves. And then based on that, each employee would pick up 50% of the cost. The state would pick up the other 50%. If the normal cost rises, both would share the risk in the increase. If the normal cost decreases, let's say the market performed exceptionally well over a long stretch and we saw a decrease in normal cost for that reason, then that would be savings realized by both parties. Both parties would share the risk on both sides. So that's the third major piece. I asked COGFA, through the help of the chair, thank you, Madam Chair, to take a look at this and give us an estimate of what this would be. They looked at the larger picture. They asked SERS to analyze this plan using their actuarial estimates and what their current system, the number of employees that they have, which of course with SERS there's a number of different categories. The complexity there made that a good candidate to take a look at how this would go. Their estimate is just for SERS, it would create a savings of about $115 million a year. That's about 2.7% of the payroll associated with that. I asked them, well, how does that translate to the rest of the systems? And they said, well, SERS makes up about 27% of the state. And they said, as a rough estimate, you can extend that, assuming that you're going to get 27% across the board. If I do that, that would result in a savings to the state of about $400 million a year. In terms of the liability, because this would also have the effect of reducing liability, their estimates, again for SERS, where they did the detailed estimate, is that there's currently a total actuarial liability in SERS of a little over $31 billion. With this, it would be reduced to about $25.5 billion, which would reduce our liability just due to SERS by about $5.8 billion. Again, if I extend that across the plans, you're looking at something on the order of 15 to 20 billion or more in overall reduced liability to the system. And since the liability is the sum of our unfunded and funded, any reduction of liability is a reduction of our unfunded liability. That's an overview of the major pieces. At this point, I guess I'd like to open it up to questions from the committee if they'd like clarification on any of these points.
Do we have questions for members? Representative Winter.
Thank you. On the first one, at least in our analysis, the pensionable salary cap, where you're taking current Tier 1 employees and basically freezing the maximum salary that they could claim a pension on to their current earnings, if that is the highest that they have. Any additional increase would not be pensionable. Is that the way that I want to understand that?
It would, right. Let me distinguish this in part from 512, because there was a lot of discussion. Look at that. There, the change was immediately in the next year, 100% of the salary was going to be affected by whatever the change was. What this says is that whatever that maximum is, that becomes your maximum pensionable salary. And in terms of calculating your benefit, at whatever point you would retire, I'm not changing any of the benefits related to that in this bill. Whatever that benefit is, you would use that salary for calculating the maximum. Just like Tier 2 has a maximum, which was set when we passed the Tier 2.
Let me just put a real life example. Say that
At the time of,
At that point, then you would be eligible to continue as long as your own salary has gone up. You could match up to the maximum of tier 2.
sure, let me, to throw an example out there, suppose you were making 120,000, which is at this point above the roughly 110,000 maximum under tier 2. But let's say that your salary growth, for whatever reason, doesn't grow very much. At the time of your retirement, let's say the tier 2 number was now exceeded your salary. It's the maximum of either tier 2 at the time of your retirement, or your maximum at the time, your current maximum at the time of the passage of this legislation.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from members? So, oh, I'm sorry, Representative Singh, sorry.
Real quick, when you talked about the 401K component for CSRS, did you use the same allocation in regards to who would be in a 401K and who would be in a defined benefit?
I'm not sure I followed. When you,
Okay.
there's,
When you had the election for whether you wanted a 401K plan or not, what percentage did you say would take defined benefit? What percentage?
the estimate from CSRS, which, and this is where the biggest part of the liability reduction in their estimation came from, was that they assumed as much as 50%, because both Tier 1 and Tier 2 would be eligible for the election. So their estimate was that that they would see a 50% in SERS. Doesn't mean it'd be the same number in all systems. In fact, in SURS, you presumably would not see that sort of number because SURS has already offered that. So I think estimating what the liability reduction, you'd really have to do a detailed calculation plan by plan because of that.
Representative Pitts.
Thank you. First, I just want to commend you for doing this. A lot of talk in this building about pension reform, and a lot less really constructive, thoughtful addition to the dialogue. Delighted that you've chosen to put yourself in category 2, not just category 1. I
Thank
think
you.
we're all the better for it. In light of your response to Representative Sanger's question about that assumption, which looked in the past I think is probably unrealistic, and the fact that if one redefines it down substantially, you don't really necessarily wind up with as nominal savings numbers as one finds in the SCRS analysis. Can you sort of comment on your view, sort of rather than what happens if you pick a number, but sort of review in a sort of a confidence interval sense of what the savings would likely to be, and your thoughts about how we should even go about assessing the question of whether that is sustainable or affordable.
Sure. To the first part, when I looked at that, and in their comments, they made it clear that the major portion of the decrease, and this is where they were talking about the liability decrease. The big chunk of the liability decrease was due to their estimation of the movement out of the system entirely. It's the way I read that. Because clearly, if they've opted, there's still a payment. There's still a payment of, in this case, around 7%. SERS, if I just take a regular SERS with the normal system, the normal cost there, 15.2%, half of that is about the same. So that's not a substantial difference. So I think the savings there look comparable in that sense. So the way I read it, and again, that's a good question, I think we should pin it down, but I read it that the bigger impact there was on the liability side than on the savings side. Could you say your second question again, just make sure I got all the points of that?
You can phrase it two ways. One is, does this achieve the goal of affordability or sustainability? Maybe the better and better question is, how does one even think about it? What's the right way to even approach that?
Well, I think one way is that I look at it from the point of view of risk. There's risk due to changing actuarial assumptions that go into these plans. which could be due to the benefits themselves, but also is due to things like longevity. It's due to things like the market. The market has a huge effect on the actuarial assumptions. We have a system that currently essentially provides that the state assumes all risk because there's a fixed percentage that we haven't adjusted for a long time. So there's not been any of the shared risk on the employee side. This provides, I think, a modest amount of shared risk, certainly not reducing the state below the contributions when these employee percentages were set. So we're not asking the state to put in less than it had previously guaranteed at the time this legislation was adopted. So I think do I know for sure it's completely affordable? No, but I could say it is certainly more affordable because we've now shared the risk across a larger pool.
Well, thank you. And I guess I view the two questions a little different, but I think the shared risk aspect of this plan is enormously commendable.
Representative Winters with another.
Thank you, Mike. We had some public mention workshops in Chicago this winter, and one of the comments from, I believe it was Rhode Island or Connecticut, was that they were moving their employees to